Great. Well, I think we'll start, everyone. So, welcome everyone today. It's very good to see you all. And it's my great pleasure to be inviting and speaking to Dr. Xin Fan today. He's an associate professor of history at the State University of New York in Fredonia, in the United States, and someone I've known for the last few years when he was in Europe, and we'll talk about that a bit later, while he was working on the book that he's launching today, which is World History and National Identity in China. First of all, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kerry Brown. I'm the director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. This institute exists to enhance knowledge about contemporary China in the UK and across the globe, build an understanding of China's impact on the wider world. We're enhancing our programme of activities this year to increase outreach and disseminate knowledge of China to a wider audience. And we encourage all of you to take part, whether you're students of ours, whether you're associates, but also from the wider public, from whichever area you're from. So please do sign up, if not already done so, to our newsletter to keep up to date with our events and research. Hannah Bretherton, Impact and Engagement Manager, will put the link in the chat box now if you'd like to sign up to our mailing list. Dr. Xin Fan is, as I said, based in the United States. And his new book, which has just been published, is the result of several years' research. And having just read it and reviewed it on my website, it was extremely kind of striking to me, the amount of research and the kind of range of references that Dr. Xin Fan kind of used and utilized in his book. And he introduces a whole range of, to me, very unfamiliar kind of figures from the 20th century, who we'll talk about a bit later in our discussion, and really opens up, I think, a kind of whole new vista of contemporary, kind of modern Chinese history, a history which in some ways is extremely, as he says in the book, international and global, and cuts against this idea, really, that China in modern history has sometimes been introspective and inward-looking. And what is interesting is he shows a new narrative between the late Qing, the Republican era, and then the communist period from 1949, where there were different perspectives towards the teaching of global history, but this was symptomatic of, I suppose, kind of deep thinking about China's role in the world and China's relationship with the wider world. So in order to really begin our discussion, I suppose I would like to kind of ask that really difficult question. Xin, you kind of, do you think the default of Chinese, culture and its intellectual history in modern times has been to sort of be more outward looking? That's the sort of default, and that the figures that you were talking about were really, in a sense, part of an intellectual mainstream in a way? Or is it that they were kind of part of a more minority, more specialist area, who in a sense were trying to kind of create something new and always coming across huge challenges? They were obviously linked to figures in the Qing that you referred to briefly, but they were also, people like Kang Youwei and, kind of others who were sort of outward looking. Are these the sort of outliers, or are they really part of the mainstream that, we've forgotten about and you're reacquainting us with?
Thank you very much for Professor Brown's introduction. I believe we met a couple of years ago in Göttingen, in Germany, where I was doing a postdoctoral research project funded by Volkswagen Foundation. And since then, we have been in contact, I believe, and we had a couple of exchanges in terms of this project. So in that case, Professor Brown knows my book, knows my project well. And in fact, he's the first person who published a review of this book. So I'm so grateful for this. And I really appreciate this question. In this book, it's titled called "The World History and National Identity in China in the 20th Century." And in this book, I adopt almost like a collective biography approach. I'm looking at 4 generations of people over the course of the entire 20th century China. So pretty much I'm looking at the gentry scholars in late Qing, the academic professionals in the Republican era, and the knowledge workers in the early PRC, and experts after the death of Mao in China today. So we're looking at the 4 generations of Chinese, I can say educated elites, who have been engaging a conversation with the world in the format of writing and teaching about the world history. So this is the individuals I'm looking at, 4 generations, and specifically a couple of individuals. These people are often less known to scholars and the audience outside of China. And the question is a fair question: how famous and how mainstream uh, uh, they're in China? Um, I think we have to look into this question from 2 perspectives. One is these are admittedly not necessarily the most celebrated and famous individuals in the intellectual history of China. Because in the past, we tended to look at the intellectual history of China through the lens of Chinese intellectuals writing about China. We had rarely paid attention to how Chinese intellectuals writing about the world. And in fact, in China, they were also somehow considered as the marginalized figures in the general field of historical teaching and research. So in a way, they're not the most celebrated figures. That's the first aspect. But the second aspect is when we're looking at the teaching and the research of world history in China, it is not a small field. I think there's a number, I don't recall the exact number, but there's constantly, right? It's the people, the scholars who are doing research and teaching about world history is 40% of the entire historians in China. So there is a fairly large number of people. And these scholars are really on top among that 40% of scholars. In that case, I think they're actually really important. And some of them are highly regarded. For example, Lei Haizong, right? He's considered as one of the founding fathers of the teaching and research of world history in China. And he was very active in the 1930s, 40s, all the way to the 1950s. And he was educated at the University of Chicago, and he was born in a Christian family, has very interesting history. And the other person, Lin Zhichun, who is considered as the founding father of the study of the ancient world in China. And in fact, if you go to China today, you visit the campuses where they taught, there are actually statues, sculptures of them on campus. Imagine that, right? Historians and as statues on campuses, right, at Chinese universities. And I think in that sense, we can recognize the significant role of these people in Chinese history. So I guess that's my answer to Professor Brown's question. I really appreciate this one. Thanks.
So, I mean, this is to talk about the kind of issue that I suppose you really kind of work on in the book about nationalism. You know, this word, this huge idea of nationalism. So, in many ways, the history that you tell is a benign nationalism. You know, that as you say, and I think there's a very good quote which you actually, I think, to let me see if I can get this. I think it's Chen Hengzhi, very fascinating figure, China's first female professor, educated in the United States. And, you know, she wrote, you quote this, that her aim was to seek mutual understanding among humanity and to draw on the culture of different countries as one common legacy. And I think this is something that's also reflected in other quotes that you show from some figures, other figures that, you know, that you kind of like, I think it's Lei Haizong. Let me see if I got this right. Yeah, Lei Haizong. And also He Bingsong. You know, these are very enlightened figures, and their kind of vision of nationalism for China, I think, is a very confident one. Do you feel that their contribution has really been acknowledged today? But because Chinese nationalism today really gets people nervous, and from what you're saying, it seems that there is a positive and you know a kind of good nationalism, but this obviously been very problematic nationalism, particularly in recent years as China has become much more powerful. Is it that if we attend to these figures, we can see that Chinese nationalism is actually something that could be good, or is it that in fact, you know, their kind of vision has been overtaken by something more problematic? To really bring it to today, I suppose.
Thanks a lot for this stimulating question. The title of this book is called World History and the National Identity. In that sense, when I'm writing about this book, it's not just nationalism on my mind. You just mentioned that nationalism is an extremely broad topic, but my question on my mind was actually even bigger than that. While I'm looking at nationalism in China, the rise and the transformation, the rise again of nationalism in China, I'm not just looking at the nationalism itself. When I was looking at nationalism, I'm always trying to place it in a conversation. In other words, what I'm trying to show in this book is there's always the other party in the talking of Chinese nationalism. Not necessarily everybody are on board. So there's always this sort of a critique of nationalism among educated elites in China. And because of that, I'm talking about this idea of the common nature of humanity. And for me, this common nature of humanity is not necessarily something invented in the modern times. Rather, you can actually trace it to the Confucian roots of thousands of years of legacy, right, of intellectual culture in China. In that sense, when I'm looking at nationalism, I'm always looking at in a conversation with the sort of global outlooks among educated elites in China. And for me, I rather consider them as this symbiotic relationship. There is nationalism and there is this global view, however naive, premature, or less celebrated. In that sense, right, for me, I'm trying to tell the other story of Chinese nationalism. The Chinese nationalism comes with a bundle, right? And it actually sneaks into this idea of thinking about China in the context of globalized world. In other words, this sort of global identity, if we can call it. And you're absolutely right. When we're looking at these intellectuals and historians, these are complicated figures. When we're looking at Chen Hongzhe, she was educated in the United States, Vassar College. And she came back to China and became the first female professor teaching at Peking University. And she taught world history. Well, in that time, it's called Western history, Xiyangshi. And she wrote a textbook on world history in the 1920s. And in that book, she specifically talked about the dominant conflicts in the recent history of the world is the one between imperialism, colonialism, and internationalism, right? So she celebrated this idea of internationalism. And for me, I feel this is not just her own opinion. It's rather an embedded theme of the intellectual history of China over the course of the entire 20th century. They're not celebrated, but we cannot deny or neglect the very existence of them. And for me, I think we cannot write a linear narrative of nationalism in China saying, you know, there was no nationalism, and now there's nationalism, and now we're in the high time of nationalism. Rather, I would try to see this always in a state of negotiation. So we do have some very radical ideas of nationalism in China today. But at the same time, do not forget, there are still plenty of people in China who are embracing this idea of globalization. Look at how many Chinese students are here in the UK, right? In America, what they're trying to do, they're embracing the world instead of refusing the world. So in that sense, I guess I'm a little bit manipulating the question, but I'm trying to argue, right? This is not just one story. It's an entangled story in a very nuanced picture, the rise of nationalism in China. I hope this makes sense to you.
It does. And so just finally on maybe the sort of Republican period, the period in the 1920s and 30s when a lot of these figures that we just referred to were really active and returning from the United States. I'm just reading Klaus Muhan's, really interesting sort of history of China from the, well, basically from the 18th century until today. And he makes a strong argument that, the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s were a time when the GMD, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, reimposed a sort of central government. And actually, he uses this phrase, it was the most successful administration in China since the middle of the 19th century, when things, got really bad. Now, from your account, it seems that you also show a China at that time that was confident, at least in the late 1920s, intellectually very varied. Do you think that this was a sort of, brief golden period? Some people like Frank Decotta have really written about this time as the great lost opportunity. So where do you situate yourself in that? Do you think that in some senses it wasn't likely that China would have an easy development because of the context it was in with Japan and everything around it? Or do you feel that there was a sort of tragic lost opportunity for China to have a different development, a different path? Because from your book, it seems it was a positive time in some ways, but maybe just for very few people.
Great. Thanks for this question. This question plays me well in conversation with other celebrated names in the field. I appreciate you doing that. I guess what can I say is when I'm looking at the Republican period in China, I'm looking at from the perspective of the long continuity of the history of the 20th century. But at the same time, I try to recognize contingency, so changes. On the one hand, I agree with you, especially 1920s. It's an interesting moment for China's intellectual culture. Some people say because there is not a very strong government, and therefore there is a large existence of intellectual autonomy where ideas flourished. And some people say this is a golden moment in Chinese intellectual history. Interesting. I guess I do not want to challenge this idea. Rather, I would demonstrate the evolution, right, or the changing moment in China during time. So in the book, I talk about Chen Hengzhe. I just mentioned that this person, first a female professor teaching at Peking University, wrote about internationalism in China. And she celebrated internationalism in 1920s. And for her, right, China should embrace the world and the international societies should collaborate on each another and to create a future globalized world. So that's 1920s. And at roughly the same time, there's the other professor who was teaching at Peking University, He Bingsong. You mentioned his name as well. And He Bingsong published another world history textbook a few years later. And in that book, he also talks about the dominant conflicts in recent world history. And in comparison to Chen Hengzhe's narrative, so Chen Hengzhe mentioned there are two dominant narratives, dominant conflicts. That's imperialism against internationalism. But by the time when He Bingsong published his textbook, the dominant conflict of the world has already changed from imperialism against internationalism to imperialism against nationalism. And he basically argued that China should embrace nationalism. And he thinks that nationalism is passive, but for the protection of the nation. And it goes along with the overall situation in China, because by the time you can gradually feel the increasing pressure of foreign aggressions, right? The Japanese expansion in the region, right? Eventually, Japan took over Manchuria, and then by the 1930s, it became a national crisis. And that would have impact on Lei Haizong, right? In the early part of the 1930s, he's really a world historian, right? Teaching interesting stuff about world history. And he's one of the few who are really, have very globalized views. But by the 1940s, in the moment of national crisis, in the middle of the war against Japan, he pretty much embraced the idea that China should give up on democracy, should embrace dictatorship based on Chiang Kai-shek's party leadership, and China should embrace totalization of military power. And he's criticized as a cultural fascist. And I think there's a reason for people to say that. But for me, I'm not criticizing either of them. Rather, I'm observing the change of intellectual atmosphere in China. 1920s, quite liberal. 1930s, it's leaning towards the conservative side. And by the 1940s, especially in the case of Lei Haizong, we can even call that cultural fascist. For me, I guess the Republican years are interesting, but before we can offer a holistic narrative, saying this is the golden era in Chinese history, we probably want to look into the specific moments of the Republican period, right? It is not just one piece of story. It is rather different episodes unfolding under various historical moments. So that's my observation on this. I think I really like Frank Decour's book. It's very stimulating. But for me, I think it's a little bit simplistic. When we look into what's happening in China, right, especially from these individuals, we can sense the fear, anger, anxiety, as well as aspiration and hope.
Good. So, in fact, we've already got some questions here. So, one of them actually, I think, would be good to ask you now, which is from an anonymous attendee, but it's a good question. It said, actually, this is a book launch, and they say they would be wonderful to hear more from you about the book itself. What is the overall thesis? How do the chapters progress towards their argument? And what does it tell us about China today? So this is probably something you could speak for about 2 hours on, but I suppose having just sort of covered the earlier kind of argument of the book, maybe you could just sort of give a minute or two about what you think the key argument of your book is before we move into maybe some of the later period that you cover from the People's Republic in 1949 onwards.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. It will help me to set up the context for this conversation. The book is pretty much a history of the rise of world history discipline in China over the course of the entire 20th century. And in that book, I talk about how world history started as an idea in late Qing period, gradually evolved into professionalized and specialized the field of knowledge production by the time of the 1980s. I'm looking at the rise and the transformation of world historical discipline as an example. And I'm investing into this sort of a complicated relationship between a national identification and the global outlooks through the lens of the writing of history. So in other words, I'm using historiography to discuss the changing worldviews in China about 100 years. So this is pretty much what I'm talking about in the book. And the book follows the chronological order. It has one chapter on late Qing, one chapter on the Republican period, two chapters on the early PRC, so about 1950s, and one chapter pretty much talking about 1970, late 1970s to the 1990s, and then have a conclusion, pretty much summarize the significance of the legacy of world historical studies in China through the lens of historiography. So pretty much that's what I'm trying to do in the book.
Excellent. I'll come back to some of the other questions a little bit later, but just to talk about this very important transition between, pre-1949 and post-1949. One of the issues in the book that's really, really puzzling to someone reading it today is the very fierce argument about two things. One was slavery in Chinese society and whether there had ever been any slavery. And the other was about the Asian, I think it's the Asian mode of production, isn't it? Or the Asian, and it seems that these were issues that completely obsessed people in the 1950s and 60s. And you explain why in the book, and it's a very good explanation, but maybe could you just sort of maybe sort of repeat that explanation, because I think it's really fascinating in the book, and I think it's something that is illustrative of the big differences pre and post 1949.
Thanks for bringing this up, Professor Brown. This is actually something that I've been struggling to do. The question here fundamentally is historical materialism, Marxist ideology. Can we write an intellectual history of it? Right. So world history in China, my book is not the first one. About 20 years ago, even 30 years ago, right, there was a book on the issue. And in that book, the author makes a very clear argument that the world history in China is the handmaiden of political ideology. And in a way, the author is right, because the rise of world history as a scholarly discipline really took place after 1949, in the time of communist regime. Well, that makes sense. But at the same time, my thinking here is, can we write an intellectual history of political ideology? Can we write an intellectual history of Marxist historiography? And my take on that is, yes, we can do it. But it requires some intellectual effort because there's a very clear condition. That is, in the 1950s, there was this effort from the totalizing state to control knowledge production. And we have read a lot of fascinating stories about intellectuals lost their intellectual autonomy in the time of radical politics. Where's the agency of people? And do they have agency? And in that sense, I actually borrowed some ideas from post-colonial studies. And I try to write about this nuanced exercise of agency under the time of radical politics. And for me, Marxism or Marxist historiography came to China as a whole package, with assumption that world history follows the same trajectory. So every single country would follow the same trajectory in the common development stages, defined by 5 stages. One of them is slavery, and the other is feudal society, right? So basically the idea is every single civilization would follow the common trajectories of development, 5 stages, from primitive society, slave society, feudal society, capital society, and then eventually reaching to the communist utopia. So that's the idea, 5 stage of development. But the question here is whether or not Chinese history could fit into that common stages. Especially Karl Marx actually wrote something about the Asiatic mode of production, and he never really fully explained what is the Asiatic mode of production. Is it part of slave society, or part of a feudal society, or part of a primitive society? So my argument here is, if the state wants to exercise total control, then the state needs to have a complete blueprint, holistic view of the world. But what if this blueprint is flawed? And my argument here is exactly because the Asiatic mode of production is not clearly defined, it allows interesting conversation. It allows Chinese intellectuals to exercise agency even under radical politics. And this is the reason why you can see there are so many interesting conversations took place, especially in terms of the question of how you understand slavery in China, and where do you place Asiatic mode of production in the context of Chinese history. So the energy was being channeled into the into the area where the political ideology was not clear. Ambiguity generated agency, in that sort of situation. So it took me a lot of time to think through this period of time. But at the same time, I do acknowledge, I do appreciate the sort of a nuanced discussion in the 1950s vis-a-vis these issues, as you mentioned, the issue of slavery, the issue of Asiatic production. I have an entire chapter on the issue of Asiatic production, which is, for some people, can be really challenging.
And then I suppose sort of finally, as a sort of general question, before we move to the question and answer, and please do put in any questions that you have, that those who are attending, and I'll ask Dr. Fan them. You refer in the 1980s, I think, to Changchun, I think, where a Institute of World History, I believe, or an institute covering world history was set up. And it seems that got quite a lot of support, and there were a number of scholars there, some who were kind of returning to the area after many years of political problems, and some who were new to it. What is the status today, do you think, of this area? I mean, to bring it right up to date, I mean, is there sort of I'm assuming that, there's enormous specialization now, kind of that there's people who are knowledgeable about hugely different areas. And I mean, and it's not within the same framework, say, as the 1950s or 60s at all, but there would be restraints probably. I mean, there are kind of things that you're not going to be able to talk too much about. So what is the status of world history studies today in China, to bring it completely up to date? And does Changchun still figure in this, or are there other places that are also important now?
Thanks a lot for this question about the state of world historical studies in China. But I wonder if I could go back to talk about that institute and the history of it a little bit more, because I want to give people some sort of understanding where this is from. As I mentioned, in the 1950s, there was this debate between about the Asiatic mode of production, which can be really boring to people today. But in that debate, there were two famous scholars. One is Tong Shuye, and the other is Lin Zhichun, two people. The other is Lin Zhichun. And they spent a lot of time, energy discussing this issue in the 1950s. But then by the time 1970s and early 1980s, Tong Shuye passed away. Lin Zhichun became the most important figures in the field. but he still remembered the past debate on the Asiatic mode of production. And he recognized the significant role of ancient world history in informing China's position in the world. And therefore, in the 1980s, right, this person who was very much involved in the debate in the 1950s, in the 1980s, he lobbied the Chinese government and basically got a special funds from the Ministry of Education to establish an interesting institute in Changchun, the northeastern part of China, right, in the middle of nowhere, people like to say today. And that institute, in the early 1980s, started to recruit foreign experts to teach ancient history and languages in Changchun, including ancient Greek, Roman, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, all sorts of ancient histories, very much specialized. And this served the foundation of the future specialized ancient world historical studies today. The institute still exists, and the institute is still highly internationalized. I believe they're still publishing English language journals that can be quite influential among certain areas. And they're organizing international conferences. So in that sense, I'm trying to tell the continuity of world history in China from 1950s all the way to today. So that's the first part. And the second part, let me get back to your question, the state of world historical studies in China. I think on the one hand, it is a big teaching field. In China, the college students, all of them are required to study world history, at least 2 years. And that's a lot of teaching positions. We're still looking at perhaps more than 40% of the entire teaching staffs in China considering themselves as world historians. And that's one thing. And the second thing is, in comparison to the state of specialized research on ancient world, at least in America, I'm observing the decline of the field because in the marketplace, there are less people who are willing to study these topics like ancient Greek history, ancient Latin language. So we see the shrinking of the field. But in China, it's on the contrary, it's actually on the rise. There's a lot of state funding channeling into the studies of these ancient subjects. Last summer, 2 summers ago, I met a friend who was doing a study. He's a scholar of ancient Greek history. And he talked about the state of his study. And he told me, Xin, what I'm doing here is great because each of my book can be easily sold over 10,000 copies. And he's writing about ancient Greek history. So in that sense, I guess it's an interesting momentum to observe what's happening in China. There are problems we all know, but at the same time, I really, it just puzzled me. Or so much funding is being channeled into the areas like this, right? Ancient Greek history, Latin language, archaeology in Mesopotamia, things like that. So it's an interesting observation from my side.
Great. In fact, there is a question by someone about world history in the United States and world history in China. And they say, given the current situation of an emerging new Cold War between China and the United States, will China be rational on world history in the future? Can they learn from the previous exploration of on the ideas of world history, or become even more inward-looking? So what you say, well, there's lots of effort going into this, but is this kind of effort that's going to be productive, or is it going to be reinforcing maybe, not such welcome ideas?
Oh, this is a great question. Thank you so much. And this is the reason why we're doing this. I'm learning so much from the audience and young generation of scholars. So this is a great question. First, I hope there is no Cold War between China and America. So I really hope that is not happening. I understand why some people think that way. But from my personal feeling, I hope it's not happening. I hope it's never going to happen, right? So that's my personal position on this. And the second thing here is, it's a great question to ask, and it's wonderful way to think about the the future of world historical studies in China. What if, right, we're facing a very gloomy future, that China and America are engaging a new version of Cold War, and the two countries are becoming more and more assertive. Another question here is really stimulating. So where does world history fit into that picture, right? Are the world historical studies in China going to be accomplice of the new Cold War? I think, from my point of view, is I would like to go back to what I have been writing about in my book. That is, nationalism and the global visions are coming with a bundle. As a bundle. So I agree. There will be scholars in China who are doing world history and perhaps embracing of very radical views of the world. So it's possible. But at the same time, do not forget the other part. Some scholars maybe will embrace nationalism, strong national, cultural nationalism, but there's also other scholars who are going to challenge these nationalistic views, who are still going to embracing the globalized world. So I really want to see this as a dynamic picture, rather looking at the world history in China as a monolithic voice. So for me, it's really the dynamic relationship matters here. Hopefully, we're going to leaning towards the more globalized vision of the things.
So as we've been talking about nationalism, in fact, there's a couple of questions really about that. The first is from Matthew Thongmin Lai, which is about what is the difference between nationalism in China before 1949 and after 1949 to the present. And I suppose a question associated with that, another question is the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. I mean, presumably, that's obviously something that you do talk a little bit about in your book, but is there a trend of Chinese patriotism that is separate and distinct from Chinese nationalism?
These are great questions. Thanks a lot for these wonderful questions. And these questions will make me think. Maybe I'll write another book or maybe two books. Who knows, right? These are really very good questions. And first, let me start with the question about nationalism before 1949 and the nationalism after 1949. I would like to put a small chapter or small episode in between. Because 1950s, when we're looking at China, there's this rise of a strong sense of historical materialism. And there's a state effort to introduce Marxist ideology. But Marxist ideology actually, in a way, can be understood as antithesis of nationalism, because it assumes the global trajectory of historical developments. In that sense, when we're looking at 1950s, we're really looking at a very interesting dynamic. That is, it was the communist state that was trying to repress Chinese nationalism. And it was the Chinese nationalistic individuals who tried to challenge Marxism in order to have a break for themselves. So this sort of really interesting dynamic gave us something to think about. That is, there's not one Chinese nationalism. Rather, there are many visions that can be understood or interpreted as Chinese nationalisms. And here, the tricky question is, what is the position of the state, the government? And in that case, I think naturally I would like to move on to the second question, the relationship between nationalism and patriotism. I think this is a great question, and I hope to honestly have to think about this more in the future. And but for me, I think this patriotism, it seems that this is relatively benign, at least when we're looking at the meaning of the language, right? The term itself, it seems more benign. And definitely there's a passion for the country. And this often makes me to think, as professional historians, are we allowed to be passionate about certain topics? Are we going to be 100% rational? Are we so cool? Can we be fully objective? In that sense, when I'm looking into the individuals I'm dealing with here, all of them are people. They're like us. They're passionate beings. They're sentimental. They care for things, and they have certain biases. So in that sense, I guess when we're dealing with the issue of patriotism, we first and foremost we have to recognize the historians are people, and historical writing is the product of rational and irrational beings, and it's not 100% objective. So for me, rather this opens up the possibility for even more conversations in the future. How, as professional historians, do we recognize the agency of sentimental beings? I guess that's something that makes me think a lot, right? These are great questions.
Yeah, no, it's a good point you've made, though. I mean, after all, historians and scholars are human beings, so the aspiration for objectivity is obviously a good one, but still, no one can really say that they can be completely objective. They're starting from somewhere. So someone, I think James Chalk has asked this question about the difference between Western nationalism and Chinese nationalism. So we come back to this word nationalism again. Again, I know it's not something that your book addresses directly, but from your kind of history that you've outlined, do you detect some big differences between the kind of Western sort of sense of national identity and Chinese national identity in terms of the way it's structured? And I mean, I think one point you make in the book, which is very clear, is that there's an asymmetry, you know, that the Chinese did look hard and long at what was in the West and in America, whereas it was never really properly reciprocated. So, I mean, there seems to be that imbalance, whether there's some meaning to that or not. It'd be interesting to hear your views on
that. Again, another great question. It seems that you have really a very wonderful bunch of people. They're so smart, well intelligent questions. And I try to avoid directly comparing issues, and that's my methodological approach. It's my biased view. Why? Because I'm dealing with this epistemological struggle. That is, can we really just identify the thing in a very complex environment of culture, politics, society, and we just bring it up and then we compare it to another thing in another society? So in that case, for me, it's very difficult and challenging to compare Chinese nationalism and Western nationalism. I'm not sure if I'm capable of doing it. And because as I mentioned, when I'm looking at the Chinese nationalism, I'm now looking at one nationalism. And when I'm looking at the Chinese nationalism, I'm not just looking at the Chinese nationalism, I'm looking at Chinese nationalism vis-a-vis other issues, especially global visions. And if I do the same to the West, then of course, that's probably not just one book, many books to follow. I'm glad I'm able to have the opportunity to write all of them. But for me, I guess it's a methodological challenging question. And how do I deal with this issue? For me, I follow people, and I follow the transnational experience of a people. Maybe it's really difficult for us to compare Chinese nationalism and Western nationalism, or whatever you name it. Maybe we cannot do that. At least not me, maybe someone else. But we can do something else. That is, we can trace an individual journey. This person was in the West and now in China. And how does this person deal with this nationalistic feeling in both societies? So that's something actually we can do. And here, I'll give you one example. Lei Haizong, again, this is a key figure in my book. He was educated in the United States in the 1920s, returned to China in 1927, and later became a big professor at Tsinghua University. Later, he taught at Nankai University. So here, this person has a transnational experience. And I mentioned that he later in the 1940s embraced a very conservative idea, saying that China should concentrate on military totalization and should embrace a military dictatorship centered on Chiang Kai-shek. So he had this very strong view of the world, very conservative, and even we can call it a cultural fascism. But this actually has something to do with his experience in the United States. In the 1920s, while he was studying in America, he was observing the world. And as a person who came from a Christian family, he paid a lot of attention to the social gospel movements. And for him, the progressive movement in America basically was in the state of failure. And then he published an article sharing his thought. He said, well, this probably means individuals are all for themselves. And we're all selfish people. And therefore, we should embrace power and politics. And in that sense, maybe his experience in America in the 1920s eventually was evolved into his radical thoughts in the 1940s. In that sense, we do see the entanglement of Chinese nationalism and radical ideas in the West. So I'm not doing the comparison, but rather I'm tracing a link. Hopefully this makes sense to the person who's asked the question. Thanks a lot. This is a great question.
Thank you very much. So just a final question from G. Leslie about the relationship really between nationalism and then, this very complicated idea of the Han and what you might be able to call Han nationalism. And so the question really is, does it sort of nationalism in China necessarily mean, particularly today, Han nationalism and its dominance? And does that mean that Tibetan culture, Mongolian culture, Uyghur culture and language are always kind of being pushed and up to a point, almost extinguished? Is that the logic of this, or it's not necessarily the logic of this? It's actually something, as your book shows, that could be more embracing and not necessarily linked to a particular ethnic group.
And yes, this is a very important question, and this is probably one of the single most important questions when we're talking about Chinese nationalism today. I recognize the significance of this question, but I would like to invite you back to the 1950s. In the time when the communist regime transformed historical studies in China, there's this name called the golden flowers. There were 5 golden flowers in the study of Chinese history in the 1950s all the way to the 1980s, even to the 1990s. These golden flowers pretty much means the biggest questions in the field. One is this question of historical periodization. That's what I talked about in my chapter on the Asiatic mode production. But another question that is related to this is the formation and transformation of the Chinese people. So here we can use that as the foundation to discuss Chinese national identity today. But in the 1950s, I think few scholars would embrace this Han chauvinist view of China. Rather, the argument at that time was the formation of Chinese people is the collective efforts from all these nationalities in China, not just Han Chinese, but also Tibetans, Uyghur populations. So that's the conversation in the 1950s. But somehow this conversation has already changed into something else today, and which is perhaps an unfortunate event. Right? I absolutely agree with the underlining meaning of this question. That is, we should get beyond this very, I think, essential view of nationalism, even nationalism itself. Right? I think that's something that we can definitely talk about in a wider context. And by the way, I'm not Han Chinese, I'm Manchu. But for me, I do not see there's a strong conflict between my Chinese identity and my Manchu identity. But I would have some trouble embracing Han identity and Manchu identity, right? So in that sense, I guess when we're looking at this issue, it's a much nuanced picture. And as historians, my job is go back to the beginning of this conversation, right? 1950s and even before. And of course, as political scientists and other scholars, I think your job probably is looking at it today. So we have a clear division of labor in this.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much. I'm afraid, although we've had some other questions that stimulated a lot of, really interesting questions, alas, we've run out of time today. But the book, World History of National Identity in China, by Dr. Xin Fan, is published by Cambridge University Press. And it's certainly, kind of really worth reading to address some of the questions that you talked about today about these issues of national identity and inform and enlighten them. So I'd really like to thank you for sharing your views today with us, Xin, and for all of the people that have joined us and asked such great questions. We'll be sharing this recording online for those who missed it. Our next event will be the launch of our colleague, Dr. Constantis Simonis' book, The Chinese Communist Youth League. So please check out our website for details of that. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very much for participating today. And Hannah's just sent the link for Dr. Fan's book. So please do many congratulations on that book. Great. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Dr. Fan. Look forward one day to seeing you maybe in Europe again or in the United States.
We'll do that. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.